What if I told you the first time I trusted my gut was as a freshman in high school in the middle of a Sephora? Welcome to the Trust Your Gut podcast. You know, we live in a world that runs on mostly logic and reason, but I'm here to provide you a roadmap to life using the most ancient and arguably underrated form of wisdom, your gut. This podcast explores all you need to know on how to harness your own intuition through life's highs and inevitable lows. From relationships to parenting, to wealth management and career shifts, I'll walk alongside you to better understand how to lean into your own intuition for guidance and support. My name is Dr. Alaina Puff, school psychologist turned intuitive coach, and I'll be guiding you through this adventure as I share my personal and professional experiences on how I learned to tap into my own intuition and how this changed my life forever. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Trust Your Gut podcast. My name is Dr. Alaina Puff, and I'm going to be your host today. Today's a big day, guys. Today, I have my first official guest on the Trust Your Gut podcast. Woo! We've been waiting for this moment. I just want to thank all of you who have reached out to me in support of those first 4 episodes, telling my story, sharing my testimony. It has just been such a cool experience. And as I had mentioned in those previous episodes, being able to bring others onto this podcast has always been a central focus for me. Being able to amplify not only my living testimony and experiences, but those of others. And so this episode is particularly special because I am able to shine light on other amazing people doing wonderful work and shining their light all in different parts of the country and world. So today, without further ado, I want to introduce my guest, my friend, my colleague, my soul sister, Gabby DeGregorio. Gabby, thank you for being here.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So Gabby and I have quite the origin story, which we're going to get into today. And Gabby was actually a critical player in my own spiritual awakening. So I definitely want to take time today to share about that. But before we get into it, I also want to preface that Gabby and I are actually working together right now to co-create a really special event for Flow State Coaching and Consulting, my business. I am so thrilled to announce that Flow State is going to be hosting our first weekend-long intensive retreat in Sedona, Arizona. This is a beautiful opportunity to gather some women in community to come together during transitional and pivot seasons in their lives to really facilitate meaningful and transformative growth. And so when I came up with this idea a few months ago, I said, I really want to get some women together on the sacred land of Sedona and create something magical. I was just thinking through it logistically, and the reality is as an entrepreneur and business owner, there's a lot of things that you're really good at, and there's some things that are just not your forte. And planning events is something that I just personally really struggle with. And so I was running through my brain of, who could help facilitate the logistical side of this retreat, and Gabby came to my mind. She has a long line of history of planning some amazing events, trips, vacations for people. It's really your gift, Gab. And so she has graciously agreed to help co-create this beautiful weekend for some amazing women saying yes and stepping into their transformation. So if you're interested and you're looking for an opportunity, the name of the retreat is called Reset in the Red Rocks, and Reset is exactly what it's going to be. And so whether you're local to Arizona or across the country and you're interested in looking and stepping into your spiritual being and really getting clarity around the things that you need in your life, whether that's on a personal standpoint or even professionally, this is an opportunity to come and fully receive as you are and do it with other amazing women who are all committed to the same cause. And so I'll go ahead and leave the details in the show notes so that you can go ahead and take a look and see if maybe this is something that's aligned for you. But I am so excited to host this, and I'm so excited to co-create this with you, Gabby. So with that being said, I thought it would be really great for our participants. They've had 4 episodes of getting to know me at this point. I really wanted them to be able to understand and get perspective of who you are and who you are to be. So my first question for you is really around where did your journey with intuition begin? And if you could kind of share a little bit about your relationship with your own intuitive knowing.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think as women, we're always given a little bit more space to connect with our intuition. Um, I think my family had a lot to do with it. My abuela, I'm half Cuban, and my abuela was always really tapped into that kind of stuff. She was very religious. She was Catholic, but she always believed in, the spiritual realm, and she spent a lot of time talking about it when I was younger. Um, and she always talked about her experiences like seeing spirits, in like corporal form. And my tia was always really big into psychics, things like that. Like that has never been like a taboo in my family. It's always been something that is normal. And then also my mother, both my parents are chemists, so you wouldn't really expect this, but my mom kind of raised us in like Eastern medicine. We always got our vaccines and stuff that we were fine there. But I had a lot of trouble with anxiety when I was younger. I didn't know like the name for it. I didn't know how to like articulate it,
Right.
but it manifested in stomach aches a lot. Like doctors used to think that I had like ulcers. I'd given myself ulcers from like the amount of stress that I had, and it's
Mhm.
because most of it was because I did gymnastics as a child. And it just was not the right like sport for me. I think it was the performative aspect of it was just not like who I am as a person. I think growing up in the 90s, like gymnastics was like the cool sport to do. Especially after like the 1992 and 96 Olympics. Like that was like the cool thing to do was gymnastics. And I definitely fell prey to that. And I loved like, the relationships, the friendships I made through gymnastics. That was like, those were my best friends through like my younger years. But at the same time, I think the sport itself was just not the right fit for me. I enjoyed like learning gymnastics, but actually performing, like going to meets and things were, I mean, waking up on meet mornings, I remember just being sick to my stomach, being like so
Mhm.
nervous.
Yeah.
Um, and just not knowing how, like as a child, to articulate that. I think my mom just got so tired of like always taking me to the doctor. She has another stomach ache. So she would take me to the Eastern medicine doctors. I would go to a homeopathic doctor. And for years that did help. I ended up not doing gymnastics later in thank God. Like I think I'm a lot healthier for it.
Yeah.
Um, but I basically got forced into that by growing out of my body. Like my body was too big to do gymnastics at a certain point. And honestly, like thank God. I think that was the first time that like leaving gymnastics, and it was such a huge part of my identity that, you know, you kind of feel that like it's like dread, but then you feel like that relief, right? And then you're like, oh my God, like that was the first time where I feel like I hadn't been listening to my intuition. Like I couldn't let go of that part of me because
Mhm.
it had divined me for so long. And once that like I finally got forced out and the decision was basically made for me, the sense of like overwhelming relief and I mean, beyond the loss of like identity, right? Like that was a whole nother part of it, but like the relief that I felt and like the stomach aches were gone, the stress was gone. Like I just couldn't believe I was like, oh, that's what that feels like. Like that's when it finally like clicked into place. Like, wow, that was completely wrong for me. And I did it for so much longer than I should have. But you have that niggling thought in the back of your head, like maybe this isn't right for me, and that's when I feel like I learned that lesson of like, hey, you should probably listen to that voice in the back of your head or like that feeling in your stomach, right? Like my stomach had been talking to me
The entire
for
time.
10 years and I wouldn't listen to it, right? So I felt like like when I was coming on the podcast and I knew like we would be talking about intuition because that's like kind of your big thing was, thinking back on like when was that first feeling of, oh, that's what that is. Like that when it clicks into place of like finally listening to yourself. And of course my hand was forced, but I still learned the lesson nonetheless. So
As it often is.
yeah,
Sometimes the
right.
hand forcing is absolutely necessary. So yeah, it sounds like based on what you shared, kind of the culture of your family was to be more open-minded and willing to kind of stretch the limits of, medical treatment, as you mentioned, and just like believing in like spirituality and this idea of like multiple lives, past lives, etc. And so that was the primer, it sounds like. And then by, getting permission, I'll say, to step away from something that was such a cornerstone of your identity really sounds like it freed you from the stress and anxiety that it was really inducing, that being gymnastics.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I
So,
learned so much from that experience. Yes.
yeah, it sounds like it. So, tell us a little bit more about, around what age you were wrapped up with gymnastics and what those coming formative years really looked like for you now that you were set free.
Yeah, so I started gymnastics when I was like 5 years old, so young. And I think that's why it was so hard for me to let it go. Like all of my best friends were gymnasts, and I spent all my time at the gym. And, it was hard to form, like that became so wrapped up in my identity. It was hard to like parse out, like, who am I without it? And, I did gymnastics through, I would say, when I was 13, maybe. Um, and no, I guess 12. So I was basically 5 to 12, so like 7 or 8 years. Um, and then, once I left gymnastics, like that was kind of a catalyst to like try and figure out who I am outside of it, right? And there were pieces of me that hung on to it. There were, I instead of doing gymnastics, I went into diving, which was basically gymnastics, but just in the water. Like it was easy, it wasn't a challenge. And I kind of floundered in that for like a year before I found rowing. Um, but I think like the challenge of like losing something that you identify as like that is something like part of who you always thought you would be, right? Um, that early in life, I think was such a challenge in like me trying to like ask that question of like who am I actually? Like I don't want to define myself as external factors, right? Like I don't want to define myself as I'm a gymnast or I'm a rower or like I have this job. I learned that very early in life that like these external factors don't say anything about who I am as a person. Um,
Mhm.
and so learning that and like the importance of, hey, like listen to your gut, listen to your head, um, that early in life, I think has persisted throughout the years. Yeah.
That's fascinating because most kids that age are wondering what they're having for lunch. Like wondering what time their favorite show is going to be on later that
I
night.
mean,
Like,
sure, that was absolutely part of it.
oh, of course, but even the nature of the questions that you were grappling with are just from like a psychological standpoint are not developmentally appropriate. Most kids aren't having these kind of revelations, and I think this is something I see come up so much in my work with intuitive children is that the gift of intuition it truly is a gift, but it also comes with a sense of burden because a lot of kids that are just, young and still developing are grappling with very adult level realizations in a child's body. So that can be really distressing. That can be really difficult for parents to navigate. For a child to even communicate that to their parents,
Yeah.
that I'm having this existential crisis at 11 or 12 years old, and I don't necessarily know if this is normal or who to talk to about it. That really resonates with me because it plugs into my own story as well.
Yeah.
So you mentioned rowing, so I think this is an important time to reference our origin story. Can you share with our audience a little bit how you and I graciously crossed paths like I don't know how long ago at this point,
Or
like
14, 15 years ago?
14, almost
15
15
years ago.
years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, so I was a rower. After gymnastics, I did diving for a couple of years and then I went into rowing. And so I got recruited to row at Bucknell University, which is where I met you. And it was so funny, like coming into Bucknell, I wasn't really sure I even wanted to keep rowing. I was pretty burnt out. I'd already rowed for 5 years at that point. And I was like, I told myself, oh, I'll row for a year and then kind of like reassess. That obviously didn't happen. Uh, And I think it also kind of ties back into, I was so like jarred and like almost traumatized by like my loss of my identity as a gymnast when I was younger, that like the idea of losing rowing as part of my identity, that like later in life, and I truly like rowing was a much better fit for who I am as a person, and I think like it added a lot to my life. So it wasn't like I was struggling with health issues while I was rowing. Like I it had a lot more positive impacts on my life than gymnastics did. But at the same time, I think like, could I have been happy without it? Absolutely. But when I was 20 years old, I couldn't see my life without it. And I had a lot of friends in rowing, and obviously you. Um, and the community, like the team, the camaraderie, that's what I loved about it. And I also like reflecting back on our, origin story. um, I was thinking like the way we grew through the 4 years at Bucknell, like it's such a time of, growth and like self-realization and challenge, obviously, with throwing and, everything that we went through.
Trauma bonding.
Yeah, exactly. That goes without saying. But then like, we remained in each other's lives after graduation, but like more peripherally, like we would see each other usually once a year. Um, and we would talk every few months and we would catch up, and it was always just like very surface level, right? It was, when you're in your 20s and you don't have those like, I don't know, those deep, deep connections that we have now. I don't know, I just felt like we were always kind of like peripherally circling each other, right?
Yeah.
And then that all changed in 2020. Um, you
Okay,
know,
wait, before you go into that, I want to highlight something.
mhm.
So you referenced this, and I want you to go in a little more detail for our listeners. Um, so obviously, being Division One athletes together bonds you in a way that goes without saying. And so after graduation, it was really important to maintain some kind of friendship, even though we refer to it as now more as being surface level. I think that was really the first time that you started stepping into like the planning and organizing kind of
Yeah.
structure of your brain. Can you speak a little bit about, even outside of, stuff related to me or our immediate friend group, like because I feel like in your early 20s, that's when that skill really developed and took off.
Yeah, I think it was like just a nature of me being really unhappy with where I was living in Manhattan at the time, working a very high stress job. Um, and I did that all because I like thought that that's what I was supposed to do, right? Like after I graduated college, my boyfriend at the time was from New York. I knew like he'd be living in New York. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll just move to New York and get a job. And it was very, high stress, demanding, like lots of hours. And so I think this all kind of started as an escape from that, right? Like it was, my way of maintaining some kind of control over my life that I felt was kind of spinning out of control. Like I ended up in New York by default and in this job because it was available, and I mean, paid well, and I met lots of great people through it, and there were positives, but there were a lot of negatives as well. And I felt kind of stuck. And so I think that I don't know, me living for my like vacation time and like making the most out of it, planning like every minute, was my response to like the reality of what my life was in that moment.
Mm.
Which is great. I mean, I did learn a lot and I have developed a great skill out of it that was kind of unintentional. But at the same time, like it is kind of sad to look back at that version of myself because I know like why I was doing what I was doing. Now I know. Um, but yeah, I mean, while I was living in New York, I lived for my time outside of New York. Like I didn't want to be in Manhattan. Anytime I could get out of the city, I would. So every year I planned our trip that we would see each other on. Um, and as we got older, the destinations got more interesting, and the trips got more involved. But yeah, I think generally, you know, it was my way of maintaining some kind of control over my life. And it was a bit of a trauma response in a way.
Yeah, no, but it's one that I think so many people can relate to. I know as when I was working in public schools as a school psychologist, I lived for those breaks. I lived for those destinations. I mean, I think before I left Ohio to move out here for my doctoral program, like I think I was traveling at least once a month, and it was because I was so unsettled at home. And so I think a lot of people can just like plug into that narrative of like I'm living for the opportunity to get out of here, and it is to some degree a trauma response of just not feeling in control of the day-to-day aspects of your life and seeking that external outlet. So it sounds like unintentionally you developed this really beautiful skill that has now carried with you into this season of your life. So okay, so then as you were saying, 2020 happened. So obviously 2020, the year the world stopped. Can you share a little bit more about where you were going with that?
Yeah, so again, was really big into planning trips at this point in my life, living for the trips. And in 2019, I had done a big road trip with my then boyfriend, fiance, now husband. Um, and we had done like a 3 month like road trip of the US. And then we moved and we were living in Philadelphia and the world shut down. We ended up moving and staying with my parents for a while. Then we were staying with his parents, just by nature of like they had more space. We have a big dog. Like we wanted, a yard and to live by the beach and etc. So we were living with his parents at the time that this all occurred. And this was October of 2020. And I was like, I'm so like antsy. I need to get out of my parents' house, your parents' house. Like we need space. We're engaged at this point. Like I was so antsy. So I guess it was September 2020 at this point. So then I texted you and I was like, hey, like, do you want to, if I come hang out in Arizona for a few weeks, like, would you be cool with that? And you were like, yeah, let's do it. So I then planned like another cross country road trip. And a few weeks later, we got in the car and we drove to Arizona. We stopped a couple places on the way, but we drove to Arizona and spent like, I don't know, 6 weeks out in Tucson, living like 2 blocks from you, in an
Oh,
Airbnb. Um, and I just felt like that was still at that point, I felt like we had, still that general surface level relationship. I felt like we had done a girls' trip in January of 2020 before the world shut down, where there was like an inkling of
yeah.
that like deeper connection that happened.
Yeah.
And where you guys were like, Gabby, like we're really worried about you. And I was like, don't be worried about me, I'm good. And and yeah, I don't know, like that was so interesting. Like I felt like I left that trip and I was just like, oh, that was kind of a different feel than our previous trips. And yeah, and then, I wanted to come see you and just get out of New Jersey for a while.
Escaping, right? Like the escape.
Exactly. I mean, I
The
was
motive
still in
was the
that
same.
escapist mindset, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so I think like that gave us the chance, like those whatever 6 weeks in Tucson really gave us the chance to like connect on like who we are now. Because I felt like every time we saw each other previously, we were kind of reliving like our past selves, like our college selves,
Yes.
right? Like we were
Yes.
slipping into these personas that we had created in college. Um, Almost unintentionally, like that was just the dynamic of that friend group. And we all just kind of slipped into it out of habit and nostalgia, I guess. There's nothing wrong with that, I guess. But
Yeah.
I think those 6 weeks really gave us the opportunity to get to know each other as we are now. And
Right.
um, then we had like a moment on a park bench in Tucson.
Yes.
I don't know if you
When
want
you
to
put
ask
it that
questions
way,
on that.
when you put it that way, I mean, I think, to fill in the gaps for our listeners, what was going on was I was in the threshold of writing my dissertation. I was in the second year of my doc program and in just like a very unhealthy place in my life. Like I was really struggling, and up until that point I had not told a soul about what I was living and experiencing every day, and just really in just a dark place. And so this is the message that I want to share with you all is, Gabby pops over escaping from living with her in-laws. And, you know, this is the power that we have in each other's lives because what happened on that park bench in Tucson was, you know, she had known that I was upset and that something had happened, you know, in my home. And all I remember, Gab, all you did was you looked at me and you grabbed my hand and you said, we don't have to keep it surface level if you don't want to. You can you can talk to me about this stuff,
I
about
remember
what's on your
saying it's okay to not be okay,
yeah.
you
Oh
know, because
God.
I remember we were sitting there like with our coffee and you were like, no, it's fine, you know, and all this stuff. And I was just like, something is going on. But like you weren't like I knew, but I didn't know what. And I was just like, we don't have to pretend like everything's okay, you know, like I'm here for once, you know, like talk to me.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I did not know how big that moment was gonna be.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah.
As one usually doesn't. But what it was, you know, for me, it was someone finally giving me the permission to to speak, to share, and to do it without judgment or without any kind of assumptions being passed, and to do it from like a place of love. And I still talk about it with people in my circles because it was the moment that somebody shined their light on me. Like you truly shined your light on me. I'm all choked up over here. In a way that for the for really truly the first time in my life I felt seen, like it pierced right through me. And you know, the shell that I had created, that many of us do as a coping skill and a strategy, having somebody who can actually see you, who can like cut through that and get to your heart, has the power to unlock so much potential within inside someone. So what ended up happening on that park bench is, you know, I continued to relegate to Gabby that it was fine. But she planted unintentionally, probably a seed that eventually would sprout into the relationship that we have today. How cool is that?
Yeah. It's like totally different than we were, I guess, 4 years ago now, which is crazy to think about that it's been that long. Yeah, like when I think about what our relationship used to be versus what it is now, and I mean, obviously, like you have gone through so many changes in your life. We both have,
As
but
have you.
truly you
So
like
right.
have turned your life upside down in the best way possible. And it's just been so magical to watch.
Thank you, my
Yeah.
friend. Thank you. So I guess if you could share, my next question for you is around, you know, obviously being witness to the work that I'm doing, and it has opened up a lot of conversations between us. I'd like for you to share with the listeners a little bit about, you know, your relationship with your spirituality and your and like this returning back to your intuition that you and I have spoken about,
Mhm.
and just kind of being proximal to somebody who is really going through a lot of changes, like what that evokes in you.
Yeah, definitely an interesting journey as like a spectator. Um, especially because I always felt like I was more tapped into that stuff than anybody else.
You were.
Or um, like at least in our, you know, immediate circle, friend group, whatever. Um, and like we were talking about before we got on the podcast was when I was a kid, I was really, really gravitating toward this. Like I started meditating before I even knew what meditation was. I had this like book called The Girl's Guide to Spells, which is still available on Amazon, by the way,
We'll
and I
link it in the
highly
show
recommend
notes.
it. I'm not sponsored, but I'm highly recommend this book. Um, and I don't know, it just kind of opened my world. That's that book. I think I got it at Barnes and Noble in probably 2000. When I was in third grade. And you know, there's just like it's fun little spells that you can do that, you know, it just it opens your world to like this whole other existence out there, right? Like it opens your mind. And that book taught me what meditation was. Not they didn't call it meditation, but that's what it was.
Was, yeah.
So I used to do that. Like I remember feeling really overwhelmed at a sleepover one time and being like, you know what, I'm gonna like go into the other room and just kind of sit by myself for a while and do this exercise that I learned in this book. which was meditation, which feels weird now to think about as a 32-year-old, um, like 10-year-old me, like going into a bedroom to do a private meditation. Um, but I think like I definitely lost a lot of that connection with myself as I got older. Like in my, like late teens, early 20s, like in college, you kind of shed that. It was all about fitting in and conforming, right? To
Yeah.
especially in the Bucknell culture, where everybody wears exactly the same thing every day. And I remember you always talking about how like I stuck out like a sore thumb because I grew up in Florida and that does not define me. Okay. But I had a lot of Florida tendencies that made me stick out like a sore thumb in, the Northeast. I wore a lot of bright colors. Um, I didn't know how to dress for cold weather, all that stuff. And me wearing a bright pink polo shirt in the middle of winter, like, yeah, I stuck out like a sore thumb. So learning that in my first year of college and then like learning the importance of fitting in and conforming, I think a lot of that, like, spirituality, intuition, all of that was kind of like squashed under this, desperate need for, you know, acceptance at Bucknell. And I like way more than I ever felt in high school. Like high school, I definitely embraced my weirdness. Like I was fine with being weird. But I went to I went to a magnet school, so there were a lot of weird people in my school. So like being weird was normal. But Bucknell was definitely not the case. So that I was like a fish out of water there for a while. And then, moving directly from Bucknell into Manhattan, same
Yeah.
thing. Like there is
Mhm.
no space for other in Manhattan. But that's why I feel like I'm so happy now in Seattle. I being weird and like other is so accepted here and is normal here. Um, so I think, watching you go through this process has ignited that like flame in me, to reconnect with that part of myself. Because I always felt like that was part of me, especially like coming from my family where they always acknowledged spirituality, past lives, the importance of like your zodiac sign and like what it means for your life and things like that. So I think being in Seattle has like opened up that channel again, like the
Mhm.
opportunity to like really sink into that stuff. And I think even more so visiting you in Arizona, where that is so prevalent, not only in your life, but I feel like in Arizona, I feel like there's so much of that culture there.
Yeah.
Um, so I always love visiting you and like going to sound baths and Reiki and like it just really, I feel like you are my light in that like you open that channel for me, you
Mm.
know. And I think like part of that was when we went to Sedona in 2020 and we saw that like psychic and she was like, "You're a channel." And I was like, "Whoa, what?" Expand on that. um uh so yeah, I don't know. I think like it's definitely triggered me sometimes and being like, oh man, like I feel like watching you connect with this part of yourself, it gives me like I get jealous sometimes because I'm like, oh, I still feel like,
Mm.
there's this big piece of me that's missing. But there's pieces of it there. I see it and I feel it,
Mm.
especially when I'm with you. Um, but yeah, it's been a journey like trying to find my way back to it, because I feel like it wasn't fostered in me as a kid. Like it's not like my parents were like, that's not real. Like, stop bothering me with that. They would never have done that. They were very open with that kind of stuff. Um, but I just feel like society in general,
Yeah.
washes it out of you unless you are very intentional about fostering it.
Right.
So yeah, I think like you have inspired me to work
Uh,
my way back to it. But
Oh.
it's an ongoing journey for sure.
Yeah, it is. And I really appreciate like your honesty and transparency around it because even just the jealousy part, I think a lot of people can plug into when you see somebody just like crushing their healing journey and just like getting all through these breakthroughs, we lend ourselves to comparison. And so it's just like, well, wait, she's getting it. Like I want it too. And using that as markers. But, I always say to my clients, like, as long as you're on the elevator, like as long as you're on the journey, like I don't care what floor you're on, like just get on. And that's what I have to constantly remind myself as well. Something that's really interesting that came up kind of that unites your stories and your narratives together is, going back to the conversation around gymnastics and feeling like you were stripped of this identity and you were always searching for almost like a replacement, whether that was through rowing or fitting in at Bucknell or going to Manhattan. Um, it sounds like you're in a season of your life now where you're closing that loop, you're completing that loop. Does it feel that way?
Yeah, it really does. And I mean, it's scary because it's like, okay, I've really committed now to not defining myself by these exterior things, right? And now I'm in therapy, which has been super helpful. I think that has been a real journey over it's been almost a year now, probably like 10 months. Um, and I felt I so silly, but I was like, I went into therapy being like, look, I'm really like self-aware and I've been through a lot and I'm very emotionally intelligent and I'm very self-aware, but like I want to feel closer to myself. I want to feel closer to my husband. I don't know how to do that. Like I really need your help. And here I am like 10 months into therapy feeling like I'm just getting started.
Yeah.
So and I feel like, I mean, every week I walk out of there feeling like I got something big out of it. So I know that this journey is like just starting, and I'm really mad at myself for feeling like it took me until like 30 or 31 to understand that this journey is like what life is about, you know?
Hmm.
And I think part of me knew it all the time. Like I've never been super career focused or driven in that aspect, much to my parents' chagrin, um, who are still trying to push me into law school or med school. They're not very creative. Um,
Clearly.
uh, but yeah, I always knew like that's not what life's about. I always knew I wanted something bigger. There was something
Mm.
bigger out there for me. Um, and it didn't have anything to do with corporate America.
Mm.
um, um, but I feel like I'm just now starting to figure out like what that is, even if it's just like learning myself, like that journey in and of itself. But that's what life's about, right? Like learning
Truly.
yourself and shining that light on other people. Um,
Yes.
yeah.
Just
So
like on that park bench in Tucson.
just like on that park bench in
You
Tucson.
were doing it all along. How beautiful, a return home to what was always there. It's really beautiful. Okay, one more question for you. So again, another focal point was not only just getting to know you today, but really getting to understand the planner and the organizer behind you, because that is one of your gifts, something unintentionally that grew out of a very unfortunate situation, turned into a beautiful skill and asset that you're now able to do for others. So tell me a little bit about the biggest event you have planned, and kind of, for our listeners who might be facilitating their own events or retreats or things of that nature, some tips and tricks to help us who are not as creatively gifted at
Mhm.
navigating this.
Okay, so what's interesting is like the dynamic of this retreat will be so informative to me just because I've planned and I'm good at logistics and things like that, but I've never planned something that was, you know, I feel like as energetically potent as this retreat could be. Um maybe like unintentionally, like maybe like my bachelorette party and my wedding were very energetically potent, but they didn't set out to be that, at the beginning. Um, so definitely like the biggest thing I've ever planned is my wedding for sure. And it was August of 2021. So luckily like I got July of 2021. Ooh, embarrassing. Um, luckily I got all of like the pandemic to plan my wedding. Um, but really what's important when you're, planning an event that's important to you, that you feel like you're putting your heart and soul into, is to like take a step back and think, what do I want out of this experience? What do I want other people to get out of this experience? How do I want people to feel when they're there?
Mm,
All I wanted was to have like my favorite people in the world, like just have a great time and like feel love in the air. Like that's all I cared about. And sure, like you can get wrapped up in the minutia, but like really being able to take a step back and, pulling yourself back and being like, okay, like let's not get bogged down in the details. The details are important, but what is really important is, the feeling that you get, the feeling that everybody else gets like while you're there in this experience. Um, and I think like my biggest my the thing that helped me the most was that I spent so much time planning it that I would go through phases where like if I was feeling really inspired, then I would spend 2 weeks like really digging in and planning a bunch of stuff. And then sometimes I feel like, ugh, I can't look at this right now. And so I would take a week away and like not look at it. Um, so just like going with the flow of your inspiration, I think is really important. Um, like not forcing it, give yourself enough time to feel those waves and ride them instead of trying to force it all into like, okay, I have to get this done in 2 months.
mm,
And I mean, if that's what life serves you, then fine. But like, if you have the opportunity and you want, like, I'm not trying to preach to anybody about planning your wedding, but like, if you want it to feel like your wedding or your event and not just another retreat or another corporate event, whatever it is, if you want it to feel like it's authentic to you, then I feel like you need to take the time and put yourself into it, put your personality into it. Why is this event important to you and why should it be important to other people? Um, yeah, I just think like between my bachelorette and my wedding, the most important thing to me was people enjoying themselves and feeling the love in the air. And that's like the event I want to cultivate with you, like the peace that comes with being with other women of similar values and similar goals.
yes. Oh my God. So well said. And yes, the feeling like as someone who was at that wedding, like every little detail was coordinated, but the cumulative energy that was there was what I remember feeling. And so you hit the nail on the head by saying that evoking that feeling of your guests and of yourself is really the cornerstone. I love that so much. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're at time here, so we're gonna go ahead and wrap it up today. But I want to thank you again, Gabby DeGregorio. I was gonna call you Gabby Ors by your maiden name. Thank you so much for being here today, and I am so excited to continue to collaborate with you moving forward.
Yeah, I love you and I'm so excited for the retreat. And
Yeah.
thank you so much for having me, letting me share my
Yes.
story.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for tuning in today, and have a good rest of your day.